Hello everybody. Today we're going to continue covering 3D Studio Max interface. This is going to be a continuation of our last video, which took us through navigation, viewports, and the menu bar. Today we're going to go over the command panel and some of the time slider animation controls. So let's go ahead and get started. The command panel is to the right of the interface, and this whole panel here to the right is considered your command panel. There are a few added features of this command panel. You can grab the left hand part of the command panel. You can see you get your little double arrow there. Click and drag that and you can make the command panel as wide as you want. So you can have rows of features here and rows of tools in this command panel if you don't want to have to pan up and down. In the command panel there are 6 tabs that make up the command panel. The first one is the Create tab, which of course creates all your objects in Max. Creates geometry, shapes, lights, cameras, helpers, space warps, and systems are all the objects that can be created in Max. Under each object there is a subcategory of objects that you can choose from. So for example, in geometry we can choose sphere under standard primitives, or we could go to extended primitives and choose one of these extended type of primitive objects. Or we could use compound objects, which is combinations of objects for things like Boolean. So today, for right now, let's just create a sphere. Put it out there in the viewport. Shapes. This holds all the two-dimensional spline shapes that Max can create. You can create just simple lines, or if you hold your mouse button down and drag as you create the line, you get Bezier handles or Bezier curves on your line. And you have your typical shapes like rectangles, circles, arcs, ellipses, donuts, and you can see all these in the viewport are just two-dimensional shapes. They do not render, so if I were to do a quick render, you can see only my sphere renders. We can make them renderable, but we'll get into modeling with shapes a little later. The next type of geometry you can create are lights, and you have 2 sections of lights, photometric and standard lights. When we get into the lighting part of this lesson, we're going to cover standard lights and advanced lighting. So cameras, helpers. Helpers are non-renderable objects that help sometimes in your linking. Sometimes it helps with just things like using a tape measure to measure distances. You can also use them as containers for holding data like crowd data and so on. The next one is space warp. Space warps are things like wind, gravity. You can also do things like create particle bombs. You can simulate drag. So these objects are again non-renderable objects, but they hold parameters that allow you to change the way particles react and simulate real-world physics. And then this last button is systems. Systems are things like daylight systems, sunlight systems. Bones are considered to be a system. So if you're creating a custom-made rig, if we were creating a character, the bones system would be found in this area here for creating the bones inside that character. And we're going to do a whole lesson on character creation, so I would get familiar with these bones and how to create these bone systems in anticipation for that lesson. This next tab is the Modify tab. The Modify tab allows us to, of course, modify any part of an object, any geometry. We can modify objects in Max by using what's called modifiers. Also, every object's parameters are found in the Modify tab. So whenever you create an object, it has its own parameters. Like, for instance, this sphere, of course, has a radius parameter, how many segments, or you could change this sphere to a hemisphere. And each one of the geometric objects in Max have their own parameters. Each parameter rollout is specific to the object, so they will change from object to object. Alright, if I wanted to modify this object, I have a whole list of modifiers in this drop down list here. Some of these modifiers only modify geometry, some only modify certain types of objects. So for example, if I wanted to melt this sphere, you can see there's a modifier for that. So there's all types of different modifiers you can use. And the best way to learn these modifiers is just to kind of go in and start picking and choosing and playing around with some of them and seeing how they work. We're going to cover some basic modifiers a little later on in this lesson. Alright, so once I've created a modifier on this object, let me kind of show you what these first few buttons here are below our modifier window. The first one is pin stack. When I pin an object in the stack, that means that whatever object is selected at the time I pin, the parameters of that object will stay on the command panel as long as that pin is turned on. It doesn't matter what other object I have selected, I'm always going to see the parameters of the object that is pinned. So this is helpful when you're working with two or more objects and you want to always watch the parameters of one object while working with another. As soon as I unpin, now I see my box parameters here. Alright, the next button is show end result. So for example, if I turn on this melt it just a little bit, if I go down into the stack, into the modifier stack, and I can still see the result of my melt on my sphere in the viewport. But if I turn this show end result off and go down to the sphere level, I can only see the sphere and not the modifier that is on the sphere. So this toggles all the modifiers on above where I am in the stack. And this next button is grayed out by default unless you have a copy. I'll make a quick copy here and I'll choose instance. Now you can see I have two objects here that are instanced of each other, which means that when I change one, or I change the parameters of one, the other changes automatically. So they are in essence linked together as one object. If I wanted to break that link and make one unique, that's what this button does. Now these are no longer linked together in parameters. They are two separate objects and one does not affect the other. Alright, I can also remove any modifier from this modifier stack by this next button. This looks like a little trash can. You can throw modifiers away. You can also delete modifiers by right-clicking in this modifier stack on the modifier that you want to delete, and you get a rename, delete. You get a lot of options here. Turning on and off modifiers, you can do that also here in this window, or you can use this little light bulb to turn that modifier on and off. So turning on the effects of that modifier just by clicking on this little light bulb in the modifier stack. You also have a little plus symbol next to the modifier. If you click on that plus symbol, you'll get options for the sub-objects of a modifier, which are things like gizmo and center. The gizmo is the container that contains that modifier or that modifier effect. So I can go in and change or move the gizmo separate from moving the object by going in and selecting that sub-object gizmo. I can also move the center, and this would be considered the center of mass for that modifier. So not all of the modifiers have a sub-object rollout, but most of them do. So anytime you see this little plus symbol, that means you have sub-objects under your modifier. Also, if you go back up to your modifier and your modifier is still yellow in the modifier list, that means that sub-object is still turned on. So as long as that sub-object is yellow, that means it won't let me select anything else but the gizmo. So I still have that gizmo active and selected as long as that is yellow. So in order for me to select anything else, I have to go back down and turn that off just by clicking on it. Now it's no longer yellow. I can go back up, and now there's my object. And then this last button here is configure modifier sets, which allows you to create your own little toolbar of common used modifiers. So if I wanted to go in and configure my own little modifier tool set, I could do that here, and it would show up in my modifier tab. Alright, that's enough for the modify tab. The next tab is the hierarchy tab. This tab controls all the linking. It also controls all the relationships between objects in Max for things like linking and pivot point positions. So I can actually go in and move the pivot point manually of this object just by clicking on Affect Pivot Only. So now this pivot point has been moved. So this is real helpful whenever you're creating rigs, or also whenever you're animating. So you have a lot of pivot point options here. You also have a working pivot option, which allows you to turn on a pivot point in a different position just by toggling on and off this edit working pivot. So you can see now that I've moved this working pivot, when I turn on use working pivot, it remembers that last position I used as a pivot. Just think of this as an extra pivot point that if you ever want to go in and you don't want to actually move the pivot point of your object, you want to have an extra pivot point recorded in space for that object, then that is kind of what this is. So I still have the option of moving that working pivot. And you have tools like resetting your transform and your scale, which is something we'll talk about when we get into the animation portion. Also, inverse kinematics, or IK button here. This deals with how hierarchy and bones work in 3D Studio Max, specifically when dealing with character rigs or any other type of linking rig in Max. And then you have your link info, which allows you to go in and lock different axes in different transforms for each object. So if you didn't want your object to be animated or be able to move in one axis or the other, you can actually go in and lock those axes out through this link info section. This next tab is your motion tab, which holds all the parameters for your controllers for each object. Controllers in Max are programs built in that control each object's transforms and how those transforms react in animation. So you can see here in this controller rollout, you have your 3 transforms for this object: position, rotation, and scale, and then you have sub-objects or subcategories underneath those transforms that deal with each track of the transform for that object in each axis. So for example, if I wanted to create a controller or assign a controller to control this object's position, I could do that by clicking on the position transform and assign a controller by clicking on the assign controller button. That will control this position with things like a noise position or a wave position or a path position, so I can have this object follow a path. So any other control that you want to have on this object other than moving in an X, Y, and Z position with your move tool can be done by assigning a different type of controller. And the next tab is your display tab, which holds all the display options for your viewport. You have some hide filters here. You can hide your geometry shapes just by clicking on these filter buttons or filter check boxes. Hide unselected, unhide all, hide by hit, hide by name, hide frozen objects. Frozen objects in Max are objects that cannot be modified or selected. If you freeze an object, it's very similar to freezing objects in AutoCAD. If I freeze an object, then I cannot select it, I cannot change it, I cannot affect it in the viewport. Only when I unfreeze it can I regain control over that object. So this is helpful if you're working with a lot of objects and you're constantly accidentally touching an object and selecting it, or trying to click another object and you click something else by accident. So if you have a lot of objects, or if your scene is real congested, this helps us only change the objects that we want to change. And you also have some properties here in this rollout for that specific object. So you can change the way that object is displayed in the viewport by, for example, display as box. This helps cut down on your memory usage. You can tell it to back face cull, which means that any normals on the inside of this object will become transparent. You can make this object see-through. Show frozen in gray, which means that once this object is frozen, if I turn that show frozen in gray off, this object is frozen, but it doesn't show it in gray when it's frozen. And this next tab, or this last tab, is your Utilities tab. This Utilities tab holds special tools and programs in Max. For example, Max has its own thumbnail viewer called the Asset Browser that can be accessed through this utility tool or utility tab. So if you wanted to go in and select images, you can do that through the Asset Browser. So the Asset Browser only displays images, and again, it's just a thumbnail viewer for Max. You have a lot of other programs here like motion capture, measuring tools, etc. Or you could actually go in and choose more, the more button, and you get a few more tools here that are specialty tools in Max. Things like your polygon counters, your skin utilities, Flight Studio. Here in this top, at the very top of your command panel, you have the name of your object. This can be changed. Just by overriding it here. You can also change the color of your object by clicking on this little color swatch, and it opens up the color tablet for Max, which allows you to go in and change or choose whatever other color that you want this object to be. So each object gets a default color when it is created. It is a random color. Whenever you create each object, they randomly get a color assigned to them. Sometimes the color is the same, sometimes the color is different. as you can see. Alright, and that's all for the command panel. Let's go in and start talking a little bit about the animation tab, or the animation controls. Animation controls are found right underneath your command panel and just left to your viewport controls. You'll recognize some of these buttons. They're kind of universal. There's a play button, a rewind, go to end, go to beginning. These control how your animation is played back in the viewport. And to the left of those are your animation record buttons, and of course they control how you record animation in Max. So just to do some simple animation, I've got a simple animation on this sphere just from point A to point B, and I can play that animation just by clicking the play button. I can also go from frame to frame by clicking the next frame button, or I could go to the end or at the beginning by clicking go to end or go to beginning. Also, if you right click on your animation controls, you get the time configuration dialog box, and this contains all the settings for how your animation playback controls work. So you can view your animation playback frame rate in NTSC or PAL mode. You can change the frames per second, which is set at 30 frames per second by default. You can show the time display in this time slider track in frames, seconds, minutes, frames and ticks, and so on. Also, your playback can be controlled in real time by dragging the time slider, which is this little slider button here. You can have the animation update in only the active viewport, and we have options for looping the animation whenever we play it. We can also change the speed at which the animation plays back in the viewport. We can change the direction. We can have it play in reverse, forward, or ping pong back and forth when it gets to the end and to the beginning. We also have options for rescaling the time of our animation. So if our animation ended up being too short or too long, we can go in and say rescale time and change the length of our animation or add frames to our, and this will actually rescale all the keyframes, rescales all the animation to fit that length of time that you specify here in this window. And we have below that some options for how you use your key steps tool, and that's your key steps button here with the big key on it. When we get an animation, we're going to get into that a little more in depth. So you have your key filters, which will filter out what type of keyframes you see in the track bar. If you only want to see rotation keyframes, you can uncheck everything but rotation, and it will only show you those keyframes in this track bar. The next button is you can set your default tangents for your keyframes. Each keyframe has tangents which control how the animation enters and exits each keyframe, and each one of these exit and entering tangents have a different type that can be set. So you can set this by default, so each keyframe will have that tangent created by default whenever it is created. These next two buttons are your auto and set key. Auto key is sort of a record button for recording animation. Anything that is changed in the viewport or in the parameters of any object while this auto key is turned on will be animated if it is changed at different frames. Also, your set key is similar to auto key, except in the fact that you can actually accept animation or not accept animation. So you have the option of, if the animation that you've done is acceptable, then you can click on the set key button and that animation will be recorded. Or if you move on from there, your animation keyframes will not be set. And again, we're going to get into the specifics of how these animation controls and animation tools work whenever we get into the animation portion of our lesson. That's all for the animation controls. The only button left is right below your animation controls and to the right, and that's your time configuration, and we've already covered those. So that's it for this lesson of Max. Come back and we're going to cover our transforms in video 4, and that is one of the most important parts of editing and manipulating in Max. So don't forget and come back for that. Thank you for choosing Osmosis Training.